So over the next 30 minutes or so, I want to discuss some of the recent advances and developments in the use of drugs and research looking at new uses of old drugs and how these developments could impact on our future. And I'll be talking about a lot of specific examples of current research that's going on, and then try and discuss a bit more broadly about what these types of what implications this might have to us as individuals and as a society. Now, I want to make the point that my talk is not going to be about the use of drugs for medical purposes. This is something that, obviously, there's huge amounts of research being done. Generally, if you go to the doctors are very open, and there's good discussions about positive and negative side effects to different drugs. And that what I'm talking about is the use of drugs and pharmacology to improve and enhance our normal well-being, above normal human sort of capacities, cognitive abilities and this type of thing throughout the entire lifespan. The first thing I'm going to talk a little bit about is something that's been termed cosmetic pharmacology. And this is the idea that there are drugs that might be able to enhance mood, increase confidence, reduce anxiety, and generally improve our ability to socialise with each other. I mean, it all sounds like very positive things. It might sound a little bit ridiculous. But a number of years ago now, there was a book by Peter Kramer. It was called Listening to Prozac, and he was one of the initial psychiatrists that really started using a lot of Prozac in the clinic, and he wrote this book which ended up on the #1 top sellers list. It was over a decade ago or so, and it's very much it's been credited with sort of increasing the general use of Prozac and antidepressants sort of outside of the pure clinical usage. And I have to say, it's an incredibly interesting book. It's now a number of years old, but it's all about case studies, and I'm going to take you through just one example. And it's somewhat mind-bending in how these drugs can change so many aspects of a individual's personality. So this is all about Prozac, but there's a number of other antidepressants that sort of work in a similar way. So the example he gives is of Tess. Now, critically, Tess is not clinically depressed. He's a psychiatrist. She's a patient has come in because she's having a number of problems with her life. Now, as a bit of background, Tess grew up as the eldest of 10 children, and she was physically abused growing up. Her father died and her mother was depressed. So in the end, Tess raised the family herself. Now, prior to Prozac, as I said, Tess was not clinically depressed. She was involved in one destructive relationship after another, including multiple failed marriages, many affairs with abusive married men, always felt obliged to help others, particularly her sick mother, had very low self-worth, regularly cried, unable to experience pleasure, absence of hope, loss of sleep and appetite, guilty thoughts. Sounds pretty dismal. Now, after Prozac, after taking for a few months, she reported being happier. This is what's amazing. Better social life. She went on 3 dates in a weekend. She was more confident and confident. She asked for a promotion at work and received it. She stopped looking after her mother, moved to a different town, changed friends. She clearly became had a personality that was more approachable. She said, people on the sidewalk asked me for directions for the first time. I laugh more, all of these types of things. Then after the doctor took her off Prozac, and the most remarkably, she said, I don't feel myself anymore. She returned to how she was before, and this is actually a theme throughout the book, which is really, I find it incredibly interesting, how many of the patients that were given these drugs for the first time in sort of 20, 30, 40 years were reporting, finally, for the first time in my life, I feel like myself. I mean, that's an issue that I'm not going to get into today, but this idea that you can fundamentally change who you feel, how you feel, who you think you are, to me is incredibly interesting. And one thing that I think this raises is people often, think, well, it's not great if you're just taking a pill to sort of get more confident, feeling better about yourself. These types of things raises a lot of problems. And certainly across the US, there's a huge, there's a very large usage of these types of drugs for people that aren't clinically depressed. And my sense is that the average person on the street, if you had a colleague at work that was a shy person sitting in the corner, had a low self-confidence, was never really being promoted and felt a bit sorry for themselves and was struggling through life, if they took a pill, felt better, felt confident, got a promotion, you'd probably be a bit annoyed about that. Whereas if you found out that actually all of a sudden this person's more confident, they'd been reading all these self-help books, they'd been working really hard, they took ownership of their problem, they thought, right, I really need to become more self-confident, I'm going to work hard at this, you'd somehow have admiration for that person. And one thing I'm just going to raise, a sort of philosophical question, is, well, why is that? You know, why is it that the books and the sort of therapy is considered necessarily so much better than drug use? Now, a lot of people would say, and I should say, look, I'm being somewhat provocative here, but if you think about it, the extent to which anything is changing your mood, I mean, if you believe that the brain is what's generating your mood, then you need to think about how these books and therapies and things are actually influencing the same brain. And I think it's a very valid point that's often raised that, well, if you've got a problem, like if you're being abused and you're in abusive relationships, it's important to get to the bottom of that. You need to solve the larger life crisis. But if you think about it, here's a person who's took a drug and she's on her own has managed, with this extra confidence of the drug, has made massive life changes to actually put herself into a much safer environment. So, all right, I'll leave this here, but I'll just let you sort of think about this in terms of the ways that drugs can really have profound influences on the way you view yourself and those around you, and sometimes for the better. Now, as I have here with the pills and the books, people often think, well, drugs are bad, but, you know, vitamins, natural compounds, they're okay. So I'm going to switch to a compound called oxytocin, which is a hormone that's found naturally in the brain. It's released from very deep within the brain, and it's most sort of well known or understood to be important with mother-baby bonding, and it's released during lactation, during breastfeeding, and is very important in that sort of unbreakable bond between mother and child. Now, I'm going to take you through this experiment. It's one of my sort of favourite experiments that I've ever come across. I think it's incredibly interesting. And I'll just explain the game. So this was done a couple of years ago by a group in Switzerland. And what they did is they set up a game. This was between university students. And there are a few important bits. They got a number of students in a waiting room prior to the experiment. So they had a sense that they were playing against real people. They knew not directly who their competitors were going to be, but it was believable enough that they were playing against a real person. And so then they were taken to separate rooms. They didn't know who they were going to be playing against, but they, as I said, they had a strong sense that it was a real person that they'd just been sitting next to, a sort of stranger that they'd been sitting next to. And the game is this. The experiment gives them $12, all right? And they can take that $12, put it in their pocket and walk away. Or they can give the other person in a room that they won't see, but they give the other person $4, $8 or $12, and any money given to the other person is automatically quadrupled. Okay, automatically. And then it's up to that other person to decide how much money to give back. All right? So it's a complete trust game. And basically what could happen is you could keep the $12, give $0, and you'd end up with $12. Very nice and safe. If you kept $8, gave the $4, you could end up with a minimum of 8, maximum of 24, all the way through. If you gave everything, you could lose everything, or you could win $48. All right? Then they did a very simple thing. Prior to the experiment, they gave just the investor squirted oxytocin up the person's nose. All right, as simple as that. So this is a hormone, squirted up the nose, and they asked the people to play the same game. And what they found is, for some people, they squirted the oxytocin up the nose. For other people, they squirted a non-active ingredient, so just a placebo. And what they found is on the oxytocin, people were twice as likely to donate the full amount of money. And overall, concluding every sort of person, the overall increase in the amount donated or given over to the trustee was increased by 20%. So if you think about it in terms of larger economic decisions, that's actually a huge proportion of money. And they did a very important control where, as I said, in the first case, they went to a lot of effort to give people the impression that they were playing against real people. Anonymous, but real people. Now, in the second experiment, they said, look, game is exactly the same, but you're not playing against a real person this time. You're playing against a computer that's been programmed to behave like a real person. So based on hundreds of games that have been played before, we'll take the probability at which you just get one of these real human behavioural responses. Okay, so it was a risk game, but the probabilities were exactly the same as the real human behaviour. And in this situation, there was no difference in terms of the money that people gave to the computer. So they, and I think quite convincingly, argued that this really is something specific about trust. It's not just about risk. These are people that are feeling more of a sense of bonding with their fellow human beings. Okay, so the question is, what are the implications for this? Are they good or evil? And I mean, one thing that really strikes me, if you think about this, is the idea that it's a nasal spray. So I just keep thinking that, you know, one day we'll walk into some sort of car salesman's office and there'll be oxytocin being sprayed through the vents. And this is obviously not going to be a good scenario. But on the plus side, there's a lot of evidence has been accumulating now. This is relatively early days, but a lot of studies have been looking at things like autism and postnatal depression, so really working at the sort of bonds with mother and child, and and also sort of social anxiety and these types of things. And it's having clear benefits towards these populations. And one thing that is a potential down the track is thinking about these types of drugs for, you know, if it's known from the sort of psychological literature that a very strong mother-child bond in the early years of life, and parent bond, shouldn't just say mother, is absolutely critical for a child to develop a strong sense of self and healthy future adult life. And the idea that these types of drugs and applications might actually be useful and in developing a healthy, stronger sort of adult, I think is something that we need to keep in the back of our minds. Okay, switching to another example, we've got the case of sort of productivity enhancing. Wish my 3-year-old would fall asleep like that. But anyway, partying too hard, staying awake all the time. At the moment, the main alternative to this is sort of, well, you should sleep more. If you're too tired, just have your 8 hours, 10 hours sleep or whatever, and you'll probably be functioning better. Now, relatively recently, there was this drug, modafinil, that was designed specifically for narcolepsy, and it's been found to be very effective. And basically what this drug does is the claim is it reduces the need for sleep without disrupting the normal sort of sleep-wake cycle. So unlike caffeine, that you can, if you need to push through the night, you could probably do it and stay awake. At the end of it, you'd be jittery and a little bit crazy, and you might really struggle to then fall asleep at the end of it all. So the claim with this drug is that doesn't happen. You can take the drug, miss a night's sleep, and just sort of go back to sleep the next night. Okay, that's the claim. And I don't think there's huge uses of this drug within Australia, but certainly in the US and I think in Europe as well, it's more common. I've been offered this drug before. Someone just completely casually sort of said, have you ever been using this modafinil stuff? It's the greatest thing. If you get really busy, you just take a pill, work through the night, write a few grants, you're done, and go on your normal way. And I was just thinking, wow, there are some sort of attractive elements to this. But anyway, I haven't tried it. But one thing that's quite interesting about this particular drug is I've now been teaching sort of to university courses about these general topics. And 5 years ago, when I first taught the course, this issue was a very speculative. Look, imagine if we had one day a situation where people were doing research on these drugs and found that actually they really do improve and all the claims can start being proved. what happens then? You know, should we start suggesting that, you know, doctors working through the night actually take these drugs? You know, if they're going to do a double shift and they've got other people's lives at risk, you know, then maybe we should start mandating these types of drugs. And it was very sort of up in the air. And then preparing for this, I thought, well, I better just check up and see where things are at. And I was quite astonished to read a paper that came out late last year by one of the leading, it was from a group at Harvard, a very senior researcher that is a sleep sort of expert, the absolute sleep expert. And he did a study in healthy controls, just healthy people off the street, and he put these people, 25 days, he had people in they were in a controlled environment, so there was no outside light and things, and he had them on 30 hours awake, followed by sort of 14 hours in nighttime sleep. So really stuffing up their circadian rhythms and really extending the amount that they needed to stay awake every day. And he was comparing this drug with caffeine use. And on every measure, it far outperformed sort of caffeine. And in terms of, you know, the jitteriness, the ability to respond in terms of motor actions without making mistakes, and also all types of cognitive, memory, on every measure, it well outperformed caffeine. And also he made the point that the sleep in between these points was much closer to a normal night's sleep, and all of the types of increased, I'm not sure if he took cortisol, but things like blood pressure and these types of stress responses were reduced, okay? Now, in science, I need to sort of preface all of this that for every study that says one thing, there's always going to be another study that says another thing. So we wait another year, and I'm sure there'll be a study coming out saying, actually, there are all these negative side effects. So I don't think we can sort of end the story here. But the final statement of this paper, which was published in the top pharmacology journal in the world, basically says wakefulness-promoting therapies may be an important strategy for improving safety in around-the-clock operations. Large-scale clinical research trials are needed to address this important public policy issue. So, as I said, just 2 or 3 years ago, this was really just speculation. Imagine one day. Now, here's a sleep expert basically saying that for safety, sort of public safety issues, maybe we should start considering using this drug in wide-scale sort of clinical application, not clinical, in just everyday sort of applications. So, I mean, I think it's a little bit dangerous going out quite in a research journal like this. But anyway, it really shows that the future is coming faster than I imagined. Now, you can probably think yourselves in terms of possible positive and negative implications to this type of research. And one of the most obvious things is, okay, so if we've got a drug that allows us to keep, stay awake and everybody else is staying awake, does that mean we have to do it? Otherwise, we're never going to be able to compete. This is a huge, huge problem. On the plus side, if I had a doctor working on me that hadn't had enough sleep and there was an option they could take that drug, I'd be quite happy to have them take that drug, and I wouldn't necessarily be disappointed if it was sort of a requirement of someone that might be in a sleep-deprived state. But that's just speculation. So the next thing I want to talk about is this example of reprogramming bad memories. Now, this is also a relatively new area of research, and I'll talk a little bit about a recent experiment that was done that I, again, think is incredibly interesting. So this is the idea that things like assault, sexual assault and physical assault and war and natural disasters can cause really traumatic experiences in an individual that persist well beyond the effects. Now, I was listening to the radio the other day, a few weeks ago, and they interviewed someone from the floods in Queensland, and this person reported having a full-blown panic attack every time it rained. So every time it rained, this person's heart would race, felt incredibly anxious, was sort of feeling like they were dying, sweating. I mean, unbelievably debilitating in a country where it does rain on a relatively regular basis. Okay, so this was the experiment. So what they did was they gave it, so that the drug they used is propranolol, and basically what it does is it blocks the natural fear response. So that sort of flight or fight response, that's associated with heart racing, anxiety when something bad happens. I'm sure you've all been afraid before. It ends up as a physical response. You have a physical response to these types of fears. So what they did was they had an experiment, and for the first day they showed people pictures of spiders, and as they showed people pictures of spiders, they gave them an electric shock. Okay, and they did this for a while, so this was happening multiple times. Spider shock, spider shock, spider shock. Not surprisingly, they started getting some sort of fear response to the spider every time they saw the spider. Now, on the second day, what they did was they brought people in and they gave people either the propranolol or they gave them placebo, so a non-active compound, and then they just showed the spider. Now, in the example of the guy that I talked about in terms of having a panic attack every time it rained, the idea is that people think that with these really bad memories that are triggering these physical responses, every time the person relives that experience, when they have the physical fear response that goes with it, they just keep relearning this association with the fear and the physical response. And so what they did was they presented the spiders, and in one group, these people had all the fear responses being blocked. So they could relearn okay, now I'm seeing a spider and there's no fear event. I feel perfectly calm every time I see a spider. This is great. So what they did then on the third day is they just presented the spider again, and they used some measures to assess the sort of fear response of the people. And they found that the people that had taken the propranolol in that intermediate day had significantly less fear responses. It had actually been removed. Now, to me, this is an incredibly interesting result. And when I was interviewed once on the radio, and they sort of said, this doesn't sound good that you're erasing fearful memories. And I should add, one critical step is that people aren't becoming amnesic. They remember the content, they remember seeing spiders, but they no longer have this fear response. And initially I was thinking, I can't really see too many negative uses to that. Certainly the amount of trauma that people go through sexual assaults or war or whatever is massive, and anything that can be done to reduce that. And there are a lot of trials going on at the moment using this in sort of clinical settings. But since this has become more talked about and more studies are being done, there are a few issues that are starting to come up, and one interesting one is compensation for victims. If you're a victim of a crime and a big part of the compensation is based on subsequent sort of, harm and dealing with the suffering. So if at some point, will a judge say, well, just take your pill and get over it? That's obviously quite extreme. But it's possible that you could end up with situations where someone's forced to work in a dangerous environment, or in war type situation. They're having these horrible experiences. And at some point, normally, in these cases, you're allowed to step, if you're really not struggling, coping psychologically, you can pull yourself out of this scenario. Whereas if we'll just take your pill and let's reprogram your memories and send you off again, there's obviously some problems there. And there's also issues of, I have less of personally a problem with this, but how much is your history and memories and emotions part of who you are as a person? Now, depending on probably I imagine the people that experience post-traumatic stress disorder don't feel like that element of fear is a big part of their personality. But the extent to which you can just do things that might make you feel guilty or anxious later and just be able to remove that effect later certainly could have a lot of implications. I just wanted to touch on the pure cognitive enhancers. Now, more discussions have been talked about in terms of memory and attention, so I didn't want to talk in as much detail, but I want to make the point that things like there's just huge amounts of money at the moment being spent by drug companies and individual research labs on better understanding memory and Alzheimer's and dementias and all these types of things that result in reduced memory, okay? And in terms of biologically, we have a fairly good understanding of what memory is. We don't can't cure Alzheimer's, but the biological basis of memory is relatively well understood, and it's pretty much accepted that whatever, exactly how it's working is, they need to work out the details, but certainly involves a degree of increased connectivity. So the memories are actually physical, either new connections or just increased strength of connections within these neural networks, okay, within the brain. And I guess the point is that if you've got drugs that are improving memory for people with Alzheimer's, they're very, very likely to be improving memory for the average person that doesn't have Alzheimer's. So the pressure in terms of the financial gain for developing memory-enhancing drugs for clinical purposes is massive. And definitely progress is being made in that direction. And when that happens, as it starts to increase, it's sort of guaranteed that there are going to be uses for these drugs in the healthy population. So we do need to start thinking about that. And the same with ADHD and attention. Already there's a lot of sort of anecdotal evidence and even some smaller studies showing that the drugs that are helping, things like Ritalin that help children with ADHD, also help other students without ADHD study for exams, pay better attention, and even sort of, if they're studying for exams, they're learning more and these types of things. So at the moment, particularly in the US, the use of these types of drugs for the ADHD, things like Ritalin, it was initially thought that the problem was going to be, okay, we've got in the poorer socioeconomic groups, we're going to have situations with overcrowded classrooms, kids out of control, they'll all just start drugging them, just to save money and make things easier. That's not what's happening. That's not the way things have turned out. The greatest use of these drugs is in the richest schools with the smallest class size, where the students are having their piano lessons and their swimming lessons and their tutoring, and as one extra thing, they're taking these drugs. And at the top US colleges, that's where the use of these drugs is the highest. So this idea that, you can really have drugs that improve cognitive performance, memory, attention, this sort of thing, is already starting to happen. And I guess, one thing I do want to sort of stress again is that the extent that the drug works, it's probably working because it's acting on exactly the same thing that's happening in the normal brain. So I do feel like one problem when we talk about drugs is that we think that some radically different thing is happening in the world of drugs, and that must be necessarily bad. And that's where I get here. So are drugs bad? I said in I think the title of this talk is something along the lines of, what if there were drugs that had no negative side effects? And the reason I sort of frames it like that is because I think that there are a lot of consequences to drug use that that aren't necessarily sort of captured by this, it's going to cause damage to your brain. And I think that a lot of people sort of put down the shutters or stick their head in the sand and just say, oh, drugs are bad, drugs are bad. Look, if there's a memory-enhancing drug and some other kid is having this drug, then I definitely don't want to give it to my child because I'm sure it's going to have long-term negative side effects, and so that would be a really bad thing. But I think you need to get past that and imagine a future where these types of drugs might be shown to have less of a sort of less negative side effects. And like I said, the pressure of the drug companies, just the financial motivation for these drug companies to create these drugs, it's just as strong for them to create drugs with fewer and fewer side effects, because the side effects are the reason people aren't taking the drugs and aren't spending the money. So there is a lot of research being done to reduce negative side effects to drugs. So I think the most important thing, moving forward is that, first of all, in terms of medicine, there's very rigorous studies looking at what are all the positive, negative consequences, and if something really extreme like chemotherapy, if you have cancer, then you're told, look, your hair will fall out, you'll feel incredibly sick. There are a lot of very negative side effects to this drug, but if you have cancer, it's an appropriate. The positives well outweigh the negatives, whereas if that same drug was given for the common cold, you'd never take it. I mean, it's sort of crazy, but we have the ability to weigh up these types of things, and not necessarily suggesting that there'll be a future where there'll be drugs that have no negative side effects, because it always depends on the context and the individual of how different drugs are going to affect people. But the idea that you might have drugs with more positive than negative, I think is a real possibility. And just as an example, I'm sort of nearly finishing up now, but I gave the example of the oxytocin, which is the trust drug. Now, to me, it's just not too far a stretch of the imagination to say that maybe one day in the future studies will come out really showing that, yes, between birth to the age of 3, giving this drug, you know, every day, mother and child, father and child, every day, really strengthens this bond and sets a child up for a fantastically sort of healthy, strong life. It's important for the sort of emotional development of the child, something like this. Now, you might say, well, let's wean the child off tablets like this as soon as they have to be in an environment where they need to be sceptical and cautious of strangers. But, you know, a 2-year-old's always by your side, so it's not like they're going to get in a car with a stranger. So, you know, given that we know that these types of strong relationships are absolutely critical to the development of a child, to me it's not ridiculous that things that help that might actually be considered beneficial. And they might start telling us, look, if you want the best emotional sort of outcome for your child, maybe you start taking these drugs. Okay, that's a bit out there. Now, if you look at the level of the individual, we might say things like, look, these drugs that reduce the need for sleep, it might not be great if we all are taking them, but there are situations with things like, if you know, drivers, long-haul drivers, shift workers that are working through the night, doctors that are working late-night surgeries. It's in the interest, less accidents happen, fewer deaths if people are taking these drugs. Okay, so let's have a situation where we start mandating this type of drug use for society's benefit, you know, for the individuals. And if you think, when we talk about drugs, I think you also need to think about the effect of society on a whole. And most of these types of enhancement drugs have very big effects on, you know, if they're actually helping one child get ahead of another child, then that in itself is a huge problem. And let's say we did some studies, really extensive studies, and we found that some of these memory-enhancing drugs improved memory by 5%. Everyone's memory was improved by 5%. And that they showed studies and said that 5% improvement improved general quality of life, ability to perform at work. Students were able to learn more. And the studies came back and they said, look, there seems to be overall a benefit to this type of drug use. And what's really important is that we don't end up with a situation where only the rich kids can have it. So let's make it available to everyone. Let's put it in the drinking water or something ridiculous. Now, I put all of these things out there to sort of make you think, well, this is probably ridiculous. But as I stand here, I'm 4 months pregnant, and every morning I take 2 tablets, one tablet in the evening, 1 tablet in the morning, because every doctor I've spoken to tells me I have to do this. So these are just vitamins. They say you should take them before you even get pregnant because there's 17 essential ingredients for the healthy development of your baby. Reduces spina bifida. But this is the important thing. Iodine and omega-3 fatty acids for brain and eyesight development. So this spina bifida is a clear medical sort of condition. Let's try and reduce the incidence of this. They're just saying, if you don't take these tablets, your child's not going to be blind. There's no one's claiming that. But there is a general claim that if you want the best for your child and you want them to have a healthy development of the brain and visual system and auditory system, you should be taking these vitamins. Now, this just seems to be an accepted thing, and I'm happy to believe the evidence, and it's almost the extent that I would feel like a neglected parent if I wasn't taking these tablets. I mean, that's how it sort of is at the moment. Now, next example I give is immunisation. I talked about the idea that the doctors might be mandated to sort of take these drugs for the betterment of society. Now, I'm also happy to believe that immunisation is a positive thing for my child, happy to immunise my child, but I was quite astounded that then I discovered after, the doctors would say, of course, it's a personal choice, you don't have to immunise your child if you don't want to. But if the child's not immunised, they can't go to daycare and they can't go to school. Most of the daycares around the place have exclusion policies, so if your child's not immunised, they can't go to the daycare and they can't go to school. So at one point then, you've got the freedom to do this, but then you can't actually live your life. So I don't think it's too much of a stretch of the imagination if there were multiple studies out there saying, look, significantly more lives are being saved by doctors that are taking these drugs than those that are not, then you might be given it, well, look, you don't have to take the drug, but you can't work under these situations if you don't. It's not, look, I'm trying to be a little bit sort of speculative, but to me it's not outside the realms of possibility. And finally, we all know about fluoride in water. And at some point it was just decided that this was a good thing for everyone to have more fluoride in the water. And look, I'm not denying that maybe that it is useful. And there's certainly, I'm sure a lot of research was done in terms of looking at the sort of short-term benefits to our teeth and all the rest of it. But the idea that I can be quite sure that fluoride's been in the water since the sort of early 70s, that studies were not done with a full lifetime to say what is the exposure of fluoride to the healthy human being across an entire lifetime. Those studies couldn't have been done because this type of research hasn't been going on for that long. So it was just decided by the governments, and I think the history would probably show that over the 30 years there hasn't been, I think it was the right decision. I don't think there's a lot of evidence out there saying that fluoride has been bad for us. But this idea that these types of decisions are made on the behalf of us already. Okay, so I'll just finish up here, and I guess my whole point is that maybe in the future, if you want to live an active life, if you want to be healthy, if you want your kids to learn and be the best that they can, maybe part of that will be to take the drugs that will help you do that, along with exercise and all the rest of it. Might be part of the how you become the best person you can be, or the happiest person you can be. Anyway, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Olivia, for that stimulating and provocative talk. So, over to you as the audience. We've got a microphone at the back of the room. Please feel free to queue up, have a few ideas, a few comments, a few questions. And we've got 3 people lined up there. Please.
Okay. Terrific talk. Very interesting. Thank you. One comment, and that is the idea of erasing bad memories and the possible legal consequences. Actually, I don't think that's any different from what exists at the moment. If you have a way of minimising the harm that you've suffered, then you have an obligation to minimise it, and you won't be compensated for harm that could be minimised. I mean, if you don't get the wound stitched up and get gangrene, well, you probably can't complain too much about that. In relation to modafinil, it seems to me to carry a really significant side effect, which is it would probably just set a new benchmark for acceptable levels of endurance. So that we'll all be on it, and you'll see people, sort of madly doing their emails as they're having their shower and all this sort of thing, and working around the clock, and we'll all be on par again.
Yeah, look, absolutely, and that's something that's brought up a lot. I mean, I guess in a way that's part of this point of this discussion is people would initially say, we can't be taking modafinil because it's got to be bad for our long-term use. Maybe we'll become addicted to all these things. Well, what if we don't? What if we don't become addicted? What if there's no negative side effects to your brain? There's a massive negative side effect to society. And I agree now. Having said that, we all drink coffee and we do our best to sort of push ourselves as far as possible. Now, the claim of that the man who, the sleep researcher that put this in here, was his point was, anyway, this is his point, not my point, that we're already living lives that we're not sleeping enough, okay? And we're pushing ourselves and we're taking caffeine, and that lifestyle, we're not actually able to catch up. And I guess if you look into the future, you say, well, what's more likely? Are people more likely to sleep 10 hours a day, or are they more likely to start trying to take drugs that reduce the harm to living the lifestyles they're currently living? Now, that's a very sort of positive spin on things. But I guess this is if the question is harm minimisation. I mean, I totally, and the biggest, actually I didn't talk about this, but the biggest problem is, I mean, it's already happening. So that drug was developed as narcolepsy, a very sort of rare but genuine medical condition where people fall asleep all the time. The drug companies in the States, at least, I'm not sure if it's happened here too, they've actually, a new syndrome has been developed, which is basically, forget what it's called, something like shift worker syndrome or something, but it's a medical condition, okay? And it's now been shown that there's a lot of negative side effects, like to your health, really bad consequences of people that spend, are up all night and constantly shifting their circadian cycle, and there's a genuinely negative side effects. And this is being marketed as a treatment for those side effects of the work that they're currently doing. Now, I completely agree that demands will increase, but at the same time, do we, try and help people in the current situation? It's a hard thing. Now, just on the initial point about the legal system, so in terms of the compensation, this is just a question to a lawyer, is there's one issue saying, okay, so the victim gets less compensation, but then also to an extent, like, does the criminal get, like, if it's a small cut and the person dies because they get gangrene, I presume you're not going to be convicted of murder in this, as if, unless, do you know what I mean, in the extreme situation. So if the crime itself is considered worse because the suffering of the individual is significantly reduced, does that mean that we end up with a society where rape and high-level crime...
You're raising too many questions here.
Okay, I'll leave it there.
Let some of these other people respond.
I'm a mother of two sons, one 34, one 24, both of whom have been researching and investigating taking enhancers of some kind or other. One, because I think he's decided at 34 he may be ADD, and he's ordered, because they can do this on the internet, he's already ordered his drugs, whatever, supplements, whatever, and another for anxiety, and he's already got his, and he's tried it for a few days and thinks it's working. So I'm interested from a point of view of, because they do discuss this stuff with me, long-term side effects. How do we really explore those? I mean, where are they? Can they just get that information off the internet? Yeah, I guess I really just want to be more informed, but that as a parent would be my main concern, that there could be long-term impacts that these guys haven't yet thought about.
So there's 2 points to that, and the first is that the evidence is not there. It's an unknown thing. I read a paper the other day where they're looking at long-term exposure to drugs for ADHD. It was published in a very good journal. It's like, this is a study that's looking at long-term consequences in adult populations. It was a 12-month study. I mean, people that are taking these drugs are taking them for decades. So those studies have absolutely not been done. But one important point, and I guess when you sort of said one goal that I'd like to do is actually increase the dialogue and the amount of testing these types of things, because one big problem is that the moment all of the drug tests are being done for very clinical, in very acute sort of populations, and of a certain age group, look, we'll test between 16 and 18 or whatever. But some of these drugs have been given to very young kids in totally different populations, and people are ordering them off the internet, and that's the way these drugs are being used, and the health consequences of drugs in that use is not being tested. When I was working at Harvard, at that time, so this was a few years ago now, in that year, 1,000 one-year-olds had been prescribed Prozac. All right. Now that in itself there's lots of reasons you might go, oh, and I agree, it's a natural reaction. And there are the people that are giving those drugs are doing it because they think that that's going to be helpful for the child. Okay, look, I can't go into any of the details of that, but I can be guaranteed there's no one-year-olds being tested on the safety of Prozac. So I'm not suggesting we now go out and test one-year-olds. But when I was working with his name's Stephen Hyman, and he had previously been the head of the National Institute of Mental Health in the US. And in his role, so he was the head of the government body, he commissioned a study to test the effect of ADHD drugs on 6 to 9-year-olds. And he was massively sort of criticised across the country for risking children. That's the kids that are being medicated. And there is, I think, a need to be honest about the use of drugs outside the use of medical purposes, so that we can test them, so that we can have open discussions and say, are there negative side effects? And if there aren't, then maybe we can can use them.
Next question, please.
Hi, it was mentioned when you were introduced that you did research into hallucinogenics, and I noticed that was kind of missing from your discussion. I was just curious what you thought about their place in society and use in everyday people and potential for enhancing life.
Yeah, I have to be a little bit careful with this. I've done some fairly long interviews, and there's one question about hallucinogens. That's the only thing I'm quoted on. So I guess my point is, my feeling is quite similar to the previous thing, is that we first need to have, people are using these types of drugs, and we need to test. At the moment we don't really know the positive and negative side effects to these drugs. And my personal feeling is that if we knew more about all the full side effects to most of the drugs that are currently available, they're probably not going to be, the overall picture is probably not going to be very bright. And people, if they really knew, I don't think it helps when people say, oh, if you take a pill of ecstasy, you might die, because you're probably not going to die. But there might be a lot of other more subtle effects that are very serious, and we need to think about these things. But I do feel like people think that with drugs, there's this yin-yang sort of relationship where for every positive there must be a negative. Okay, and that's not a law of nature, that's not a law of pharmacology or whatever. And so I don't think it's outside the realms of possibility that we'll get to a situation where there's a drug that has some type of effect, whether it's purely recreational or not, that doesn't have a negative consequence. And I think that, well, it would be I think it would be nice if we lived in a society where we could deal with that in a mature way and say, look, there are drugs that people enjoy taking and want to take. I mean, people do ridiculously dangerous things all the time, jumping out of aeroplanes and this type of thing, and the risks are known and people are allowed to behave like that. But I think that it's really the current situation where we just don't know what these drugs are doing, and you've got a lot of people on the internet saying, these drugs are great, man, we should all take them, and you don't have any risk, it's a dangerous situation.
Next one, thanks.
I just want to say that while it's come up as a sort of subtext, one major theme that's been missing has been genetics. I remember half a century ago, I and various friends got hold of Ritalin to help us because we hadn't been doing any work, and we studied through the night and went off supremely confident, and I remember thinking how well I'd done, and I was wrong, but some of my friends were right. There are huge individual differences in drug response. There was a drug taken off the market by Merck, and they paid thousands of millions of dollars out in compensation because Vioxx was very helpful to a lot of people with the pain you get in rheumatoid arthritis, but it killed some of them. Now, the population is hugely variable, and there may be almost no side effects for most, but there will be side effects for some. So I'd just like you to comment on mass treatment when the pharmacogenomics hasn't been done.
So look, I agree with that, and I think as an extreme example, up until quite recently, there was reasonably a fear, well, we don't want to give pregnant women drugs of just sort of experimental drugs, So if we're testing a new painkiller, let's make sure we don't have any pregnant women. The best way to make sure you don't have any pregnant women is to just let's test men. Okay, so you're probably fully aware of this, that for decades and decades, most of the drugs that were being tested in healthy men between, sort of 18 and 30 or whatever. And that does not capture the full representation. Now, through the US funding and I think also the Australian funding, you have to specifically say, I'm testing people of different sexes and different races, and to capture sort of not the Caucasian male that has a very different genotype to the entire spectrum of the humanity. And I think it's also important that the ages, you need to test across ages. I mean, if you're not going to give a drug to a child, you don't need to test it in the child, but if we're giving it to the child anyway, we need to be aware of the consequences. So I think, first of all, we need to test more broadly. And also, if you've got a drug that's being tested in an Alzheimer's population for memory, for example, I mean, they're going to be normally an elder population. There is a sex diff, I forget which way it goes with Alzheimer's, male or female. But anyway, there's going to be, it's a different sort of population. Then if we have 15-year-olds taking this drug for memory purposes, even if they're sort of doing it, illegally over the internet, there needs to be some testing of that in a controlled way. And then, look, I totally agree with you, but I feel like that should be handled in the same way it's handled with normal, medicines. And there's, at some point you can never know for every individual, and it's same, some child has a heart attack playing football because he has a bad, you can't predict every outcome. But if we do proper testing, at least someone can say, I'm doing experiments at the moment with serotonin drugs that, antidepressant type drugs, we give them to healthy people. And one rare side effect of this is sudden death. But it's incredibly rare. If you happen to have this gene and you happen to have this syndrome, then, it can go horribly wrong. But people are being prescribed it all the time. So I have to say in my experiment, you're happy to sit here and take this very benign drug that everyone takes all the time, but there is a consequence that you may have sudden death. So, it has to be, I think if we have the information, then people can use that information themselves.
It sounds like the drugs you're talking about in your lecture, that there are, it looks like there's positive benefits, but under controlled use, where they're prescribed by medical practitioners. Could you talk about excessive use, because people are notorious for wanting more of a good thing?
Look, yeah, but again, I feel like with medications, we have an understanding. You can give your child this much Panadol. You can't give them, if they have too much, they'll be sick. So I completely agree. And if your thing is just, well, maybe people will just overdose for fun, then that's obviously a huge problem. And then the question becomes more sort of one of if there's an addictive element, that's a hugely negative consequence in my mind. So there needs to be tests for withdrawal and this type of thing. But look, I'm sure you might be able to overdose on these. I don't know what happens if you just have huge amounts, but things like cholesterol lowering drugs, I get the sense at the moment it's generally accepted that the lower your cholesterol, the better, and people are widely prescribing these drugs, and there's no real sense that if that you're going to do harm to someone that doesn't have severely low cholesterol. There's these types of things, maybe if you took 300 tablets you'd be in trouble. And yeah, this is quite controversial, but there are some people arguing that things like antidepressants and Prozac and these types of drugs, they have been shown to increase neurogenesis, so the birth of new neurons, and some people are claiming that these drugs can help your brain actually get into a healthier state so that it can better deal with negative consequences in the future. And that's one reason, that's some of the motivation behind giving it to a 1-year-old, which I absolutely don't support. But there are claims, and there's a lot of preventative medicine out there, that maybe there are ways that we can improve our well-being in a way that just is better than our current state. I mean, we all are in different states. I was sort of thinking today as I was walking here, I don't think that we're all at every moment in our lives in our most happy, most highest well-being state. We could all run more, we could all eat better, more fruit. It doesn't seem to be anyone saying if you eat too much healthy food, you're in trouble. People. So the idea that too much of one good is necessarily going to have a bad isn't true in other aspects of our life. And that we just have this feeling that it is going to be true in drugs. Now, in terms of medicine, there's huge numbers of drugs that are out there, and there's a few that seem to have genuine positive effects with minimal side effects. Now, in terms of the more enhancement drugs, recreational drugs, there's far fewer drugs out there being used. So the likelihood that we're going to find a positive, purely positive one is going to be smaller. But to me, there's no real reason that there won't be a drug that's like, look, it's just like eating more healthy food. It's just helping us. It's helping everyone. It might not happen, but it might.
We've got a couple of minutes before the end, so I thought maybe not. My response was going to be about, and you touched on pharmaceutical companies wanting to make sure that there's more and more diseases they provide more and more treatments for.
Yeah.
And they're also the way that they sort of minimise the negative results of research and promote drugs that aren't necessarily targeted for one condition and promote them for another condition, which is called off-label prescribing. And one of the biggest factors that has come out in recent reviews of a lot of the previous research is the powerful effect of placebo.
Yeah.
And that's underestimated. Yeah. Now, I just wonder if you want to comment on
I think that
placebo
to the undergrads I teach at university, the first course in the neuropharmacology is on placebo, and there's a huge lab where I was working in Boston that it's all aimed at looking at the neuroscience, neurobiological effects of the placebo, and is absolutely clear. You give people these drugs that have no active ingredient at all. They have all the market, I mean, not all, but significant elevation of a lot of the sort of immune responses, cortisol reduction, changes in brain behaviour. I mean, absolutely clear physical effects. And I think that's actually a really important thing. And people will sort of say, look, it's hard to frame this, but if you're stressed and you're depressed or whatever, let's say stressed, you're really stressed and you've had a bad day and you go home and you put on some classical music and you sit down and you relax, okay? And if you feel like that's helping you, I mean, I don't think it's too controversial to say that might help you if you have a few deep breaths and lie there. It's reducing your stress to the extent that your brain behaviour is changing. You know, I mean, the activity in your brain, the changes in the neurotransmitter systems, it's your brain that's having those effects. So if a drug is doing the same thing, then it's the same brain. So this idea that psychological interventions or placebo, or if you just say positive things to yourself, imagine meadows when you're getting stressed out, the extent to which that works is because it's working on your brain and it's causing release of chemicals in your brain. So I think that's really
So maybe we should be promoting a universal placebo for everything.
Oh yeah.